Even the holiest institutions have their nasty underbellies. Today we're exploring this often overlooked aspect of medieval monasteries. While they may be known for their spiritual devotion and peaceful existence, there was often a very different reality that existed behind the high walls of the monastery. From power struggles and political manipulation to scandalous secrets, the history of medieval monasteries is rich with dark stories. Today we're going to take a look inside the thick grey walls of the church and see what was really going on in medieval monasteries. This is History Unveiled. Despite the vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience taken by monks, many monasteries were plagued by corruption, greed, and misconduct. From the sale of indulgences to the abuse of power and position, corruption was a dark and persistent problem in the monastic world. One of the most widespread forms of corruption in medieval monasteries was the sale of indulgences. Indulgences were essentially get-out-of-jail-free cards that promised to reduce the time a person would have to spend in purgatory after they died. Monks and priests sold these indulgences to the public, often making extravagant promises about the benefits they would receive. The sale of indulgences was one of the foremost drivers of the Protestant Reformation, which sought to end the corruption and abuse of power in the church. Another way that corruption took hold in medieval monasteries was through the abuse of power and position. Monks who held high-ranking positions in the monastery often used their power to enrich themselves at the expense of others. They were also known to have used their influence to secure profitable business deals and take advantage of those under their care. So much for their total devotion to God. These monks were more than happy to put themselves first. In movies, monasteries are often portrayed as peaceful and idyllic sanctuaries where the monks and nuns lived away from the disease and warfare that was so common in medieval society. In reality, life in a medieval monastery was usually a far cry from the cozy, idyllic image that a lot of people have in their heads. From dawn till dusk, the daily routine was grueling, and members of the monastery often lived in poverty. For starters, the hours were long and the workload was heavy. Monks were expected to rise early for morning prayers, followed by a long day of manual labor, study, and more prayers. The work was hard, with most monks engaging in manual labor like farming and construction, as well as intense hours of copying elaborate illuminated manuscripts by hand. And then, after all that, when the day was done, there was still more work to be done in the form of additional prayers and religious duties. Aside from the grueling hours and almost unending workload, there was the matter of resources, or lack thereof. The living conditions in medieval monasteries were far from a comfortable, relaxing retreat. Monks and nuns slept on hard beds, ate very simple and often unsatisfying meals, and lived in cramped, drafty quarters. The staple foods of the monastic community were humble, consisting mainly of vegetables like turnips and salads, hearty dark breads, porridge, cheese and curds, and occasionally a fish. To make the food last longer, meat was dried and fish was smoked. Despite the lack of variety in their diets, monks were expected to follow strict dietary rules, and meat was generally only consumed if they were sick or on special occasions. Privacy was non-existent, and even basic comforts like heat and light were in very short supply. Monasteries often didn't have much money, and so people living there had to make do with very little and fill themselves up on prayer. Medieval monasteries were often teeming with strange superstitions, many of which would seem bizarre and even absurd to us today. From the belief in magic spells and incantations to the fear of evil spirits lurking around every corner, life in a medieval monastery was often a mixture of both religious devotion and mystical reverence. For example, many monks believed that it was possible to conjure up powerful supernatural forces simply by reciting certain prayers or performing special rituals. They also believed that certain objects, such as holy relics or consecrated crosses, could protect them from evil and bring them good luck. Some monks even went so far as to wear amulets or carry talismans to ward off evil spirits and ensure their safety. Monasteries were often secretive, and it's hard to know exactly what was going on behind the closed doors of the cloister, but rumor had it that many monks and nuns were engaged in rituals and mysticism that veered closer to witchcraft than Christianity. With all the harsh conditions of life in a medieval monastery, harsh weather, long working hours, and little food, it's really no surprise that these nuns and monks turned to whatever solace and protection they could find. Monks and nuns practiced asceticism or abstinence as a way of showing their devotion to God. But sometimes this asceticism took a dark turn. The desire for spiritual purity and closeness to God led some monks to push their bodies to the limit and beyond with disastrous consequences. One of the most extreme forms of asceticism was self-flagellation, where monks would whip themselves as a form of penance and to mortify the flesh. This practice was thought to bring the monk closer to God by suffering in the same way that Jesus suffered on the cross. However, the psychological toll of self-flagellation was often devastating, leading to depression, anxiety, and even psychosis. Another extreme form of asceticism was fasting. Monks and nuns were encouraged to fast frequently, sometimes going without food for days or even weeks at a time. While fasting was intended to bring the monk closer to God by denying the fleshly desires of the body, it often had the opposite effect. Monks who fasted too much became emaciated and frail, and many suffered from malnutrition and other health problems. The drive for spiritual purity and asceticism in medieval monasteries was admirable in some regards, sure, but often it was taken to an extreme that was beyond pious and simply unhealthy and dangerous. Throughout the medieval period, celibacy was considered one of the central tenets of the monastic life. Monks and nuns were expected to live lives of chastity, devotion, and poverty, abstaining from all sexual activity. However, the reality was often far from this ideal. In many monasteries, sexual misconduct was all too common, with numerous reports of monks and nuns engaging in extramarital affairs or engaging in sexual relationships with other members of the monastery. Despite the strict expectations of celibacy, many monastics found it difficult to adhere to these demands. Some sought solace in secret relationships, while others struggled with their sexuality and sought refuge in the monastery. For these individuals, monastic life was a place of refuge from the judgment and oppression of secular society outside of the monastery's walls. Although celibacy was expected in monasteries, it was not always strictly enforced. Some monasteries turned a blind eye to sexual misconduct, while others actively encouraged it. This was particularly true in the case of male monasteries, where relationships between monks were sometimes viewed as a necessary form of support. However, sexual misconduct in medieval monasteries was by no means limited to same-sex relationships. In many cases, monks and nuns engaged in sexual relationships with people from outside the monastery, and some monasteries were even rumored to essentially be brothels in disguise. According to research from the University of Toronto, from 1430 to 1530, almost half of the monasteries investigated were faced with an instance of sexual misconduct. Throughout history, monasteries were sometimes involved in acts of persecution against individuals and groups who were deemed to be heretical or a threat to the established order. This took many forms, including the imprisonment or execution of individuals and the confiscation of their property. One example of such persecution was the Albigensian Crusade in the 13th century, in which a military campaign was launched against the Cathars, a heretical Christian sect that was seen as a threat to the Roman Catholic Church. The crusade was investigated by Pope Innocent III and was carried out with the support of the French crown as well as many monasteries. The result was the destruction of the Cathar community, with many of its members being killed or imprisoned. Another example of persecution carried out by monasteries was the Spanish Inquisition, in which the Catholic Church in Spain worked to stamp out any perceived threat to its power and influence. This included the persecution of Jews and Muslims, as well as the prosecution of people accused of heresy. The Inquisition was often carried out with the support of the Spanish monarchy, but it also involved the participation of monks and other members of religious orders, many of which were monasteries. Feel like taking up the monastic life? Didn't think so. But if you're enjoying this video so far, make sure to like it down below and subscribe. It only takes a second and it's the easiest way to support the channel and means you get to see more of the content you find most interesting here on History Unveiled. Medieval monasteries were known for their strict and disciplined way of life, but beneath the surface, some monasteries were plagued by coercion and the manipulation of those who lived within their walls. The daily life of a monk or nun was filled with work, prayer, and strict adherence to the rules of the monastery, but for some, this way of life was imposed upon them rather than chosen. Many young people, often from poor families, were sent to monasteries to receive an education or to live a religious life. And in some cases, these young people were forced into the monastery against their will and were unable to leave. This coercion took many forms, from physical force to psychological manipulation, and it was one of the darkest and yet most common aspects of life in a medieval monastery. Far from being paragons of virtue, the inhabitants of medieval monasteries were often engaged in all kinds of debauchery. Although they were sometimes poor and ascetic, other monasteries were wealthy and influential institutions, and the lack of oversight and accountability allowed for many monks to lead lives of excess and indulgence. From lavish feasts to excessive drinking and gambling, some monasteries eventually became notorious for their over-the-top revelries. It became somewhat of a stereotype for monks to use their position to indulge in their desires and passions, disregarding the vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience that they had taken. While they may have tried to project an image of purity to the secular world around them, medieval monasteries were often far from godly and were home to some rather dark and scandalous behavior indeed. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss out on any future videos here on History Unveiled.